May to explore complex issues of inequity facing many people in our community. During the height of the pandemic, we were able to continue meeting by Zoom, and we appreciate how many of you stayed with us during that time. Meeting by Zoom also gave us an unexpected but welcome benefit, being able to reach new people and new partners across the state. And so we are so thankful for these new relationships. So in addition to being in person today, we obviously are set up for hybrid Zoom meetings for those outside of Winston-Salem and also for those who are unable to attend. And so we welcome you as well. We have worked hard to make this work, and we have some good technical help. Thank you very much, Josh. And we hope that those of you joining us by Zoom, and we have a number already logged in, will feel a part of our discussion. As you have questions, if you're on Zoom, please put them in the chat, and one of our team will be including those in our Q&A session. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a few housekeeping matters. First, I'd like to introduce other members of the Faith in the City planning team. Spence O'Neill is monitoring our Zoom group here. Dean Clifford is right here. Dean's a wonderful thought partner and planning team member for us. And we have an honorary member of our team, Sarah Fox, in the back, who helps us check in folks. Diane Lipset, another part of our team, is teaching at Salem College today and couldn't be with us today. You are free to eat your lunch, and I'm glad to see that some of you are already doing so. And there are cookies and drinks in the back, and so just feel free to get up and take advantage of those when you want to. Before you leave today, if you are not part of our email contact list and you haven't already given us this information, please stop by the table again and give us that information. We do want to include you in flyers and information about subsequent programs. I also want to welcome a few special folks today, and one of those is Suzanne Parker Miller. Suzanne, back here, is Executive Director of Pastors for North Carolina Children. She's a strong advocate for public education statewide. Suzanne specifically wanted to come today to meet some people that she has only seen on Zoom. This is the first time I've had a chance to meet Suzanne as well. And she also has some information about the program called Mission Amplified, which is a lobbying and advocacy effort that she is working with churches throughout the state. So stop by as you leave to find out more about that. As I mentioned, we are beginning our 5th year of Faith in the City. When we started in 2018, our intention was to provide a forum for deeper community conversations about complex issues and find ways to work together to right those injustices. And from the beginning, our focus was on educational equity. And we are continuing that focus 5 years in, and there's so much to unpack there. And because we feel that in so many ways, these inequities are getting even deeper and more divisive. So that's why we are so glad to have as our speaker today someone who's written and spoken widely on issues of public policy and inequities across our state. Rob Schofield is the director of NC Policy Watch, a nonpartisan journalism nonprofit to which thousands of North Carolinians turn on a daily basis to access timely and accessible news coverage and progressive commentary on state and national policy debates. He has more than 3 decades of experience as a lawyer, writer, and commentator. At Policy Watch, Rob serves as editor-in-chief for a team of 7 journalists. He writes daily online commentaries, one that came out just this morning that I'm sure many of you have already read, and handles numerous public speaking and electronic media appearances. He also delivers a radio commentary that's broadcast weekdays on WRAL FM and hosts News and Views, a weekly radio news magazine that airs on multiple stations across North Carolina. Prior to joining Policy Watch in 2006, Rob worked for several years as an attorney at the North Carolina Justice Center, where he helped build the organization from a small legal services office into the state's leading anti-poverty advocacy group. His career has also included stints with the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, the American Civil Liberties Union of Illinois, and a Washington, D.C.-based farm worker rights group, the Migrant Legal Action Program. Rob is a graduate of George Washington University Law School and received his undergraduate degree from the University of California, Los Angeles. Rob will talk with us today about the various pressure points for public education in North Carolina and issue a call to action to stem the tide of disinvestment and privatization in public schools. Following his talk, we will have ample time for your questions and discussion. So please join me in welcoming Rob Schofield to Faith in the City.
Thank you, Sylvia, very, very much. It's a delight, excuse me, to be with you all today. To the Zoom audience, I apologize if I'm going to be moving around. I just can't help it sometimes. I'll try to stay in the camera focus here. I feel like I'm at a press conference here with all these microphones. It's a delight to be with you. Winston-Salem is a second home to me. My wife was raised here. She went to Girl Scout classes, I think probably in the same, I know in the same church, maybe it was in the same building, actually. My dear mother-in-law, Thorny Worley, is right here in the second row. Excuse me, 1 second. Excuse me, my goodness. You never know when that emotion is going to creep in. Anyway, it's a delight to be with you all. One of the things I was struck by with the flyer that was going around was, I got to update that mugshot. You know, it's like you take those mugshots and you really like them, and then 10 years later, you're on Twitter. I don't look like that anymore. But anyway, it's great to be with you. Congratulations on Faith in the City. It's incredible work you all are doing. Such an important discussion. I have prepared a PowerPoint today, but it's mostly just to sort of have something to focus on. There's not a whole lot of information up there, but we'll try to make it go along as we talk. I do want to take a second, though, to tell you about NC Policy Watch. NC Policy Watch actually grew out of, it was a commentary shop, a one-person commentary shop that the folks at Capital Broadcasting in Raleigh and my longtime colleague, Chris Fitzsimon, founded in 2004. Some of you may remember Chris from all those appearances on NC Spin, debating the evil one, John Hood from the John Long Foundation. I'm just trying. John's a good guy. Chris founded Policy Watch. It was really a one-person commentary shop. And then in 2008 or 9, he had the brilliant idea that with the collapse of what we now refer to as the legacy media, the traditional news media, and so few reporters covering state government, we needed to actually hire some reporters to help do that. And so Policy Watch started hiring reporters to actually, our first investigative reporter was a woman by the name of Sarah Ovaska, who worked for Raleigh's News Observer. She actually sent a state legislator to federal prison with her research and reporting on his corrupt practices. And we've since then created really a very formidable team of journalists that we're really proud of at NC Policy Watch. We have one of the best environmental reporters in the country, a woman by the name of Lisa Sword, who's just broken so many stories I can't keep track of them. She is a force of nature. We have Joe Killian, who I know a couple of years ago you had Nicole Hannah-Jones, right? Speak to the group. Well, Joe's the person who broke the story about Nicole Hannah-Jones at UNC and the whole controversy with the Board of Governors and their, reluctance to bring her on as a hire for the journalism school. We have Lynn Bonner. Lynn spent a quarter century reporting on state government for Raleigh's News and Observer. She joined us a couple of years ago. Greg Childress likewise spent decades reporting on state government and politics, principally in the Triangle. He's our education reporter, so if you're looking for the latest education news, Greg is the person to follow. We just hired a young man who's going to be a tremendous journalist. Here he is. His name is Kellen Lyons. Kellen comes to us from the Connecticut Mirror, where he was breaking lots of very important stories about a very deeply flawed corrections system in that state. And he'll be, I'm sad to say, they're reporting on a lot of flaws in our correction system in North Carolina, but he's already started to do that. He's going to be breaking a lot of important stories. And Clayton Henkel is our producer. She produces my radio show, podcast, the commentaries we do. She keeps our website running. She herself is a veteran journalist. So we've got really a great team, and we really pride ourselves on relentless coverage of state government, state policy, news, hard-hitting commentary. And the good thing about the reason Chris left me about 4 or 5 years ago, my dear best buddy, he went off to found something called States Newsroom. I think I've got it up there. You can see States Newsroom, news from the states. The national funders were so excited with the work we were doing to cover state government in North Carolina. They said, Chris, do this everywhere. And he was, well, how would I do that? They said, well, here's the money to do it. And so he's now in 29 states with newsrooms based on our model. There's the Virginia Mercury, the Arizona Mirror, the Nevada Current, the Missouri Independent. They're all right there at statesnewsroom.com, and also News from the States. That website up there, you check that out. Every morning, news headlines from across the country, as well as a very formidable and growing Washington, D.C. bureau that provides us with lots of coverage of news stories from Washington. So we're really excited to be able to provide that free too. Our email goes out on Tuesday. That one that y'all got this morning goes out to about 50,000 people, most of them in North Carolina. So we're really proud of the growing audience that we have. I should also say that one of the best things about my job, sort of weirdly, is I kind of have Jesse Helm's old job, which is kind of a weird thing. It's actually, you know, that tells me something about this audience, because as I give this speech, fewer people remember who Jesse Helm is. But you know, Jesse came to fame in the Triangle, at least doing the commentary on the Channel 5 news. You know, after the news, they would have a moment of commentary from Jesse. And the Channel 5 people, Capital Broadcasting, haven't yet gotten the guts to put me on the TV version of the news, but they do simulcast the news on the biggest FM station in the Triangle, Mix 101. And after that, there's a 1-minute commentary. And those are all available as podcasts. We call them the micro podcasts. But it's an interesting gig doing 1-minute commentary every day of the week. You can imagine it's sort of an interesting experience to be able to craft your thoughts and combine them into, or compress them into 185 words, get it all said in a minute. So it's a really cool job that I have. I'm very proud of the team we have at Policy Watch. And I hope if you send me an email or just go to our website, check us out. We'd be delighted to add you to our mailing list if you're not already on there. But today, we're going to talk about public education, right? I mean, that's what this group has devoted so much of its time to. Obviously, there are a lot of topics we could talk about today. We have so many issues roiling our public debate these days, but public education is the heart of so much of it. And this is obviously a propitious time. We are at the start of the school year. I hope for those of you who have family members who are teachers or students, or I hope it's off to a good start for you. Myriad challenges confronting us as we approach this new school year, of course. The COVID effect, we know lots of reporting on the terrible effect it's had on our kids, the learning loss, the trauma that so many young people have had to endure. We've also had these battles over sort of the whole purpose of public education. We'll talk more about that today. We've got some very practical battles going on in North Carolina over things like teacher pay and our investments in public schools. We had this weird event in recent days where, I don't know if you read about this, it's a classic example of how we've kind of had some real troubles in the public education system in North Carolina. And that was this controversy over teacher pay. The General Assembly, in its infinite wisdom, passed a budget bill last year that would link teacher pay basically to how kids did in a year of tests in their schools. I'm sure it should say principal pay. And so we had, you know, test scores fell during the pandemic. We had some principals, very successful principals, confronting the possibility of $18,000 pay cuts because of this provision inserted in the budget. And so the superintendent, to her credit, has been working to remedy that. But the way she's going to remedy that was to get some money from the COVID relief and sort of shoot it over there and plug this hole. And you're like, really, is this the way we want to run a railroad? Is this the way we want to run our public schools? Why are we, reduced to doing it that way? But yes, a lot of battles right now. And of course, as you all know, last week, the Leandro case. The Leandro case, I'm sure you've all discussed it and heard about it ad nauseum. My God, it's 28 years old now. I've lived in North Carolina since 1992. I remember when the lawsuit was filed. I remember discussing it with some of the attorneys who filed the lawsuit, what their goal was. And frankly, it was to get to this point that we're at now. Whether it will actually bear the fruit they had hoped for remains to be seen. But what they were trying to accomplish, and what we think they have accomplished, is to show that every child in our state has a right, a constitutional right to a sound basic education. Our Supreme Court agreed with that. It's done it a couple of times. The problem has been in the enforcement. It's sort of reminiscent of the whole Brown versus Board of Education, all deliberate speed. We've never provided that. Theoretically, all children in our state have a right to a sound basic education, but in many, many places it's not provided. There's not adequate facilities, adequate teachers, adequate principals. So it went before the Supreme Court yet again last week. And what the plaintiffs are asking for at this point is for the Supreme Court to literally direct the General Assembly to do its job. And the General Assembly is saying, hold it a minute, hold the phone there, Central. You can't tell us what to do. This is a matter of appropriating funds from the budget. That's the Constitution reserves that right to the General Assembly. And so, you can't make us do it. We've appropriated what we think is appropriate, and that's the way it goes. Tough noogies. And what the plaintiffs are saying is, okay, well then the Constitution doesn't have any meaning. The constitutional right to a sound basic education has effectively no meaning, and 28 years of litigation has been for naught. So really, it's a tough spot. Admittedly, the Supreme Court finds itself in a very tough spot, and I don't have to tell you, there's a very narrow partisan divide on the Supreme Court right now. We have 4 Democrats, 3 Republicans. There's indeed an election this fall in which 2 of those Democrats find themselves up. 2 of the Democratic seats will be up for election. So it's a very, very contested, very difficult situation. But it seems to me that the courageous ruling is to find that there has got to be some way to get this funding, to make it happen, to get the General Assembly in some. It's happened in other states. Sometimes it's a matter of holding a General Assembly in contempt. In some places it's a matter of literally directing the treasurer to appropriate the money. It is admittedly a very difficult constitutional dilemma, but I would argue that it's something that simply has to be done. I'm hoping very much for a good Supreme Court ruling, and hoping that the citizens of North Carolina appreciate what they end up ruling. But I think what's going on in the Leandro case, and in so many of the debates we're having over public education these days, is really emblematic of what I'd say is two very radically different views of education, of government, indeed of government, and the role of government. And public structures and systems and a market economy, indeed the very concept of freedom. All those things, I think, this debate over education is emblematic of a contest there. So let's talk a little bit about that. On one side of this great debate, I guess, and this is where I would place myself, and I think probably most of you in this room, there are those of us who see government and public structures and systems and intentional public solutions as really the best hope for maximizing societal well-being, the common good, sustainability, and freedom. We're not, for the most part, hardcore. I don't, maybe when I was 19 I was, but I don't consider myself a hardcore socialist ideologue at this point. I'm not opposed to the idea of a market economy or private property. Indeed, we see the market as one of the great innovations in human history for spurring innovation, creativity, and prosperity. I mean, you look around, you see the examples. Look at the computer and technology and telecom advances that we've enjoyed and that have made our society richer and better. Look at modern medicine. So many aspects of it are driven by market forces, advanced finance and investment practices. All of those are a function of a well-run, solid market economy. Nobody's opposed to that. But I think the distinction here is that we see that market economy as an imperfect human construction. It's something that we have made. It's a tool that humans have made to make life better. It can do good, like other human creations, it can do many great things. I just listed some. And it can also do terrific harm when it's abused or completely unregulated. I mean, look around us, look at the environmental devastation that our planet is enduring right now. So much of it a function of profit making gone to extremes. The predatory lending practices that we see right now. We're having this big debate over student loan debt forgiveness. The Biden administration has proposed and is advancing. So many of those debts that students got themselves into were the function of predatory loans, predatory high interest loans. That was where I spent a lot of my career at the General Assembly, combating when I was a lobbyist, working against some of that stuff. We see price gouging during natural disasters. That's another example of markets going haywire. Safety shortcuts. This is a debate. Chris Fitzsimon used to always tell me he had this debate with John Hood, the Locke Foundation. He'd say, John, what about the Federal Aviation Administration and the safety of airplane traffic? And don't you think there's a need for government regulation there to make that work? And John said, well, a couple disasters and the airlines will get on with the program. I mean, really, I think, believe that. So I think that's at the heart of a lot of the debate that we're having right now. It's this concept of the market, where people see a market economy. A lot of people like us see it as a tool that we use. Others see it really as something that's just sort of holy or handed down from on high in some way. And it's almost an infallible creation. And I think that's really, it bleeds into the debate over public education. So that's why obviously we have to have, from our point of view, laws that protect consumers and environment, guard against monopolies. Let me advance the slide here. I think this is really what the folks on the other side are saying. You may remember Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street. Gordon, that's Michael Douglas playing Gordon Gekko, and he was the person who gave the infamous "greed is good" speech. You know, he explained why greed was the key to success for society. And you know, I see a lot of the work I do sort of refuting that, and I think it has. I think our point of view is generally a majority point of view, but the other side has been very effective, particularly over the last half century. The voices on the right have really articulated this alternative vision in which government, you remember Ronald Reagan saying this, you know, the last words anybody wants to hear, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help. There's this sort of anti-government mantra that's been developed. Government and public structures and systems are not seen as instruments of advancing societal well-being, but as a roadblock to societal well-being. And this has come to be referred to in many circles as the libertarian view, at least with respect to the wealth and the economy. The libertarian point of view sort of goes away when we're talking about things like reproductive freedom and other social rights. But when it comes to the economy, the folks in this, what I refer to sometimes as the market fundamentalist camp, take this position that that the market is sort of holy, that it needs that we can't interfere with it. And I really think this has never really been more than a minority view, especially when we're talking about the true believers like the Locke Foundation, John Locke Foundation, and the Koch brothers. But the folks behind this point of view and the adherents to it are very skillful. They've figured out a way to attract and build a very powerful conservative coalition by combining really the libertarian true believers, with those who are really consumed with the accumulation of wealth, the 1% who really don't really believe in that point of view, but they're just in it for themselves. And those who sort of fear change and modernity, and this is especially in matters of race and social policy, they've been able to attract sort of the social agenda right into this sort of odd coalition. And so now if you just add in the people who are disaffected and feeling left behind economically, and there's sort of just that natural born American aversion to paying taxes, and you've got a pretty formidable coalition. And then came Trumpism, and Donald Trump, you know, amazingly, kind of combined it all into a very awkward, if illogical mishmash, but a very effective one. Another factor that was really important in that, and this is something I think that affects all of us, even people who consider themselves progressive, is the rise of consumerism in America. Think about this. I think there's been a shift in how we relate. We're such effective consumers, right? We all get consumer reports. We think about how can I get the best deal? How can I shop for the best possible price for myself? We even use it in how we relate to government. We think of government as sort of like a purveyor of services. How can I get the best services for myself? How can I shop around for the best school for my kids? How can I get it for myself at the lowest price? It's something I think that's afflicted us, and we sort of hadn't even been aware of it, that it was taking over us. But I think it's caused us to relate quite often to public structures and services of government, really as consumers rather than as citizens and participatory citizens. You know, you think about Kennedy's famous quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." I'm not sure a president could say that today. It's a different time, and I think we've lost some of them. So they've been very effective at that. The sort of greed is good camp has done a good job of capitalizing on all that. Let's see. And so it's playing out in the public education world. We've seen really, this is a place, of course, where state government spends overwhelming majority of its tax dollars. On one side, we've got what I'd call the progressive vision. I tried to articulate it a bit in a column I wrote last week. I entitled it "Successful Public Schools More Than Just Providers of Sound Basic Education." It's interesting. I was doing a little research to write that column. I found this quote from Chief Justice Earl Warren in the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in the Brown versus Board of Education case. And this is, what is this, 68 years ago. Today, education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. Compulsory school attendance laws and the great expenditures for education both demonstrate our recognition of the importance of education to our democratic society. It is required in the performance of our most basic public responsibilities, even service in the armed forces. It is the very foundation of good citizenship. Today, it is a principal instrument in awakening the child to cultural values, in preparing him for later professional training, and in helping him to adjust normally to his environment. In these days, it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he is denied the opportunity of an education. That's 68 years ago. It's a pretty good synopsis of one of some of the most important functions of government, of public education. And so public schools, in my view, should not be seen mere, and I don't think in Chief Justice Warren's view, as mere distributors of useful information, which is, I think, what the right has basically started viewing public schools as. Box store-like institutions that families patronize or shun as they search for the best path to a career advancement for their child at the lowest possible price. To me, that's sort of how the right has begun to characterize our schools. Instead, I believe they are one of, if not the key public institution that binds together our vast and disparate nation. They are, or at least should be, a place where American children and adults of all backgrounds come together as equals to learn about each other, about how to coexist, maybe even thrive. A place where we come not just to consume, but also to participate and contribute as citizens. The folks at the American Federation of Teachers put it this way in describing their vision of what they call community schools. Community schools aren't just centers of education. They're a place where teachers, families, community members, and service providers can come together in a coordinated, purposeful, and results-focused partnership. These schools become the center of their communities by providing the services to students, families, and neighbors that best serve their needs, while at the same time promoting stable, healthy neighborhoods. And then, of course, some of you saw the New York Times probably article that was this Sunday in the paper. It was entitled, what was the title? What is school for, right? Here it is. What is school for? It's a big section in the Sunday New York Times. You might want to check it out online. And in there, they have an array of compelling authors who say it's for a lot of stuff, obviously. It is, yes, to promote how to read and academic excellence, but it's also about living together. It's about developing citizens who will protect democracy, for giving kids a shot at social mobility, and for learning how to express ourselves, among many other things. It is, in short, it's admittedly a Herculean task, but public schools are our great hope for building an educated, diverse, peaceful, and sustainable society. That would be my argument as to what public education is about. I think a lot of people, but I think maybe we've lost our way a little bit on that. Unfortunately, the other side, as I've alluded to, that alliance of anti-government, libertarian, true believers, the what's in it for me capitalist, the fearful of change crowd, those who are worried about change in race, religion, and immigration, and sexuality. They've been hard at work for many years with this very different vision. And it was someone pointed out that there's an article also in this section by a George Mason University, which is a very conservative school, a professor who basically argues that public schools have come to be a waste of time and money. Basically, we need to totally rethink the model. So now you overlay with that the consumerism that afflicts us all, and the challenge for those who would build a great public school system is even greater. And if you doubt this, you should, I know you all have done this, visit your local school board meeting, which has to be the most thankless job there is in American politics, serving on a local school board. It is an incredibly difficult task. So what do we see today as a result of all this? Declining investments. We're now in North Carolina down still below pre-Great Recession levels when you talk about per pupil expenditures in our state. And of course, this is like a self-fulfilling prophecy that the right engages in, because they defund the schools and then they say, look at how terrible the schools are. We shouldn't give them the funding that they need. I know you had Chris Nordstrom speak to you last year. I think it was last year, about some of these same subjects. Chris had a great column the other day. He's a Justice Center education researcher. And it's sort of reflected in that chart up there. In April, Alabama's legislators passed a new teacher pay plan that is actually far more generous than North Carolina. It's Alabama. Alabama's teacher salary schedule for 2022-2023 is more generous than North Carolina's salary schedule at every experience level. Alabama's beginning teachers earn 17% more than their North Carolina counterparts, while teachers with 35 years or more of experience earn 23% more than their North Carolina counterparts. In addition, Alabama offers its teachers a 15% supplement for master's degrees compared to a 10% supplement in North Carolina, and advanced degree PhD supplements are also more generous. That's in Alabama. Mississippi also taking similar actions. It's pretty remarkable that that's not happening in North Carolina, that we've fallen so behind in a state that was once viewed as a very progressive state with public education. We've talked about the Leandro resistance from the Senator Berger and Speaker Moore, who run the General Assembly. It's sort of, over our dead bodies, are we going to do what you told us to do with funding schools adequately? We've seen the resegregation of our public schools. This is a function and a phenomenon, obviously, that lots of people have played a role in, and probably nobody has clean hands. But it's clear to me that the privatization that's taken place with vouchers and charters has really abetted this process. The hope of our schools being integrated, places in which all schools in every community are good schools, has really lost out over the last decade. In particular, we have the explosion of charters and vouchers. Voucher schools in our state, these are almost exclusively religious schools, teaching children literally that dinosaurs and humans walk the earth at the same time. This is with our tax dollars, using these remarkable fundamentalist religion tenets in schools that are funded with public dollars. We've seen the war on teachers, obviously. We've seen this whole nonsense about critical race theory. That was the big bogeyman last year, right? Somehow our teachers were trying to make all the white kids feel bad about racism. And just a general decline in support for public education. And again, I think it's safe to argue there's a self-fulfilling prophecy here. You defund schools, you make them struggle, you increase class size, you decrease per pupil expenditures, you give an alternative that's less accountable, and support for public education declines. So what do we do? What do we do about all this? I would argue spirited resistance and articulation of an alternative, hopeful view remains really our best course. I would also urge you to think about a factor that I believe is the right's most vulnerable Achilles heel, and that's what I call this libertarian greed is good argument. I really think that it has provided a cloak that has enabled the racists and the nativists and the religious bigots to seem sort of respectable. They've been able to cloak themselves with, well, you know, we're about freedom, we're about the market economy and the genius of the market. That's what this is really about, this fight over public education. And I really don't think that most people buy into that. I think the overwhelming majority of Americans still adhere to the point of view that we have a reason to have pursue the common good in public education, that the market is not holy, it is not the solution to all our problems. So I think that's one that we really need to combat. We need to combat all those confused points of view, but that's one that we really need to champion. I don't think there's any miracle cure here. There's no magic bullet, no miracle solution to this challenge. But I think if we aggressively push back and continue to emphasize the point that public schools are good and that the market is not the solution to public education, that it remains a very fallible institution, I think that's our best hope. But we also need to reinvigorate discussions of things like tax fairness and bigger investments, stronger regulation of different parts of the economy. And I think really capturing the sort of the morality debate, the debate over the whole point of coming together as citizens in public education. You know, I was thinking about, you probably have seen this before, Horace Mann, who is widely credited with being one of the people who helped birth the modern public education system in the US. This is from 184 years ago, and he identified 6 basic principles And I think they're pretty much on the mark today. The public should not remain ignorant. Public education should be paid for, controlled, and sustained by an interested public. Education will be best provided in schools that are inclusive of children from all backgrounds. It should be non-sectarian. The education should be taught in the spirit, methods, and disciplines of a free society, and that it should be provided by well-trained professional teachers. That's a pretty good list. And I guess part of what needs to happen here, it seems to me, is that people on this side of the debate need to start championing this as a positive vision for where we need to head with our public schools. Stop playing defense exclusively and start articulating this vision and championing it and speaking it out loud. So it may seem overwhelming, but it has happened before. We are on the right side here, I think. We do see that public opinion is actually, I think, with us on a lot of issues that progressives and those who would defend public education find themselves feeling like they need to play defense. I saw a poll recently that showed 69% of all Americans favor a Medicare for all universal health care system. Nearly 90% agree that racism is a problem and that books discussing race or slavery should never be banned. And 71% of voters support raising taxes on the wealthiest 2% of Americans, particularly to fund public education. So the times are tough, no doubt, but we've been through some darker periods in American history. So I think the solution is for us to keep doing what we're doing. We need to vote. We need to engage on social media, even when it's not pleasant. Sometimes we need to debate, speak up in conversations with friends and family. One of the real lessons that we've learned from the political right in the United States over the last half century is that you got to give them credit. They worked really hard and they were very pragmatic about you have to be pragmatic to be a deeply conservative religious movement that is opposed to gambling, that is opposed to so many sinful activities, and to embrace Donald Trump as your standard bearer. I mean, think about it. There couldn't be a person who's more ill cast for that role, and yet they were pragmatic enough to realize we want to change the Supreme Court and we will do whatever it takes. And they aggressively worked to do that, particularly in the last 2 or 3 decades, to change not just the Supreme Court, but the entire federal bench. And that's a real handicap progressives have, and they're going to have to be working to overcome for years and years. President Biden's done a good job of appointing qualified people to the bench, but there are an awful lot of Trump appointees out there, and that was a very intentional, long-term, long-run strategy they were pursuing. So I guess it boils down to, for progressives, you got to do the same thing. This is probably not for us; it's for our kids and our grandchildren. But if we want to leave them a planet worth inhabiting at this time of global environmental crisis, if we want to leave them with a functioning democracy, if we want to leave them with a public education system that can actually be the bulwark of that democracy, we're just going to have to get to work. It's not going to be very glamorous. It often won't be fun, but it's our lives depend on it. Our kids' lives depend on it. So I would urge you to just stay engaged in the debate. I hope I haven't bummed you out with this talk. It's a challenge we face, but if you'd like to get in touch with me and learn more about Policy Watch, there's my contact information. And yes, you want to take some questions, Sylvia?
Thank you very much, Rob.
Yeah.
Particularly as we look at a very divisive local school board election and other elections. This is something that we need to be concerned about. So we do have some time for questions. Dean's going to help us do some moderating here. We're going to also try to toggle back and forth between our Zoom questions and ones here. So please help us repeat the question, and Rob will do his best, and I know him very well to answer that. So time for questions. Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay. I think the progressives, and I'm not looking on a basis, are aiming way too high with their thought processes in elections.
Mhm.
And that is one thing that like individuals have done, is they aim a little bit lower. School boards, city councils, Supreme Court. How do we change our focus? Who changes that? On the part of the president, that was after this law. Who changes that focus?
So the question is, who changes the fact that progressives, if I'm paraphrasing you, are aiming too too high with a lot of the races that they're obsessed with when it comes to politics. They worry about who becomes president, but they don't pay much attention to who's elected to school board or even the General Assembly. I see this in Raleigh, quite honestly. I spent many years lobbying at the General Assembly, and it would drive me crazy that, you know, the core of the progressive constituency, a lot of it was centered in Chapel Hill and the Triangle. And forever, I'd be like trying to get them to pay attention to what was going on in the General Assembly in Raleigh when they were worried about what's going on in Congress, or what's going on in the White House, which were very important topics, but you're absolutely right. We need to focus at the local level. Progressives, caring and thinking people need to focus on things like school board races, local elections to city council and county commissioner, and you know, who gets elected to the Court of Appeals, things that are sort of at the bottom of the ballot that people don't pay a lot of attention to. How's that get changed? You know, I don't know, one step at a time, people like you speaking up, I guess. I mean, I think there is a growing recognition among some of the national funders who fund a lot of progressive causes that they've got to invest more resources in that. There is, I mean, candidly, there's so much money now at the top in our country on both left and right that it's hard to run a political campaign for, at least for Senate or Congress, and not have pretty much all the money you need. But there is still a need for more investments, more attention being focused on local issues, on state and local government. You know, I think the right had a lot of success there because they had such a monopoly on talk radio. For a long time, talk radio was I would go on and debate the folks from the right on the WPTF, which is the AM talk radio station in Raleigh that ran Rush Limbaugh and all those things. And man, there was a hardcore constituency of people who were very devoted. They listened to that. You know, remember Al Franken tried to do something like that for the left with Air America radio. It never really took off. You know, I don't know, again here, I don't know that there's any magic solution, but I do think I think the point you make is one that is starting maybe to percolate through the body politic on the progressive side a little bit. I think they're coming to realize it's a long-term battle up and down the ballot, and not just up and down the ballot, but you know, in the debates in school boards of what measures are actually going to be adopted and not adopted. So it's a really valid point. I don't have a magic solution to it, but I think you need to keep articulating it. And I'll be happy again to repeat the question.
I have a long history of education. Interest. My granddaughter teaches now at Raleigh, and you've been an effective lobbyist. Here's my question: if I had the ability to get a hold of a couple of $1 billion to underwrite a lobbyist for 5 years to bridge the gap between the educators in our public and our university systems who teach people like my granddaughter to teach, and the key leaders in the legislature, what do you think about that?
Wow.
I mean, everything we talk about is impossible.
Sure.
But what do you think about that?
So the question is, if you had a couple of $1 million to invest in sort of changing the debate in Raleigh, and how might you best do that to bridge the gap between the people who teach in our schools of education and the legislators who affect policy? That's sort of where you were headed with that question? Well, I'm not sure a lobbyist is the best place to invest in. I don't know. I mean, Policy Watch would be a really good place to invest. Seriously. I mean, there is something to be said for the fact that the battle of ideas is something that progressives have not engaged in at the state level in such a spirited way as the folks on the right, who pretty much put all their apples in things like the John Locke Foundation and the Pope Civitas Institute and Americans for Prosperity. They've probably put more of an effort into winning hearts and minds. I mean, one of the hardest things about the way things work at the General Assembly right now is literally, if you are a progressive lobbyist, you pretty much can't get in the door with the people who make the decisions in the General Assembly right now. The Justice Center, which is this liberal group that Policy Watch remains sort of affiliated with, has literally resorted to hiring Republican contract lobbyists because the Republican lawmakers just won't talk to. So I guess one thing would be to think about the idea of hiring people who are moderate Republicans. There aren't a lot of those left anymore, but people who are conservative, but still believe in government, still believe in public education. There are a lot of people still like that out there. I mean, those are probably the people most likely to get the ear of the Phil Bergers and Tim Moores of the world. But I would say there's also a need to invest just in shifting the debate, outside of directly influencing lawmakers. There's a need for more essays in the paper, more good editorials, more good content on social media, more television shows, more podcasts. All of that kind of work needs to happen as well. I don't know, that's not a good answer, but
Bob had his hand up first.
okay. Bob.
When I stand up, people laugh if I please. In your response to how can we help our school librarians dealing with parents who have inside of the
Yeah, the question is, how can we help our school librarians deal with the troubling state of affairs we confront right now, in which some ill-informed people have decided that they need to censor what's going on. It's a remarkable state of affairs. I was having a conversation with my colleague the other day and said, who'd have thunk it that the most boring servants we have in government, the people who run elections, like people who volunteer to take your name and give you a ballot, and the people who staff our school libraries, and these are the people who are the target of death threats and hateful comments and all kinds of venom these days. It's a remarkable state of affairs. I don't know. I think it's a contest in which progressives and caring and thinking people are just going to have to stand up and probably subject themselves to a little bit of heat and abuse. I know you can imagine how much of that I get in my email most mornings. We're going to have to be willing to stand next to those people and defend them and speak up for freedom of expression and remind people of why censorship is not the American way, and why we need to have access to a full range of information for our children. And I think as a practical matter, one of the points I've tried to continually remind people of, just about every kid over a certain age has a cell phone, right? And they probably got internet access, and they're looking at a lot of stuff that they would not see in a school library. And the notion that a book of all things is going to corrupt them. These kids who are spending their day blasting away with blood-splattered Xbox games are going to be corrupted by seeing, oh my God, a naked person or a talk of a person who is gay in a book. It's just so preposterous and laughable that I think we need to remind them of that. But it's a frightening time, and I think we're going to need to stand with our librarians, and maybe it will need a more intentional targeted effort to actually lift that up in a very specific way. But I think you raise another excellent point. Suzanne.
I, back in June, had two different conversations with two different legislators in Raleigh.
They did talk to you, so that's good.
They did. One was a very contentious conversation. The legislator from the mountains told us in an advocacy day event that funding pre-K was pointless, which I was flabbergasted to hear, honestly. I had never heard that. It was an actual waste of money. And then I had a conversation with the legislator from Forsyth County, who I would not normally think I would agree with, but found myself in significant agreement with on just a light conversation. But we were talking policy. And I was like, wow, I agree with most of what he said, surprisingly. But he isn't able to vote his conscience because Berger and Moore hold the reins so tightly. So I was curious if you had any sense of how many legislators are truly Berger and Moore mouthpieces versus those who may actually be more moderate, but can't vote that way. If there's any sense of that.
The question is about the General Assembly in Raleigh and the fact that the Republican majority pursues a very regressive policy agenda, and yet it's probably not one that a lot of their members, several of their members, disagree with. There are progressive, more moderate members of the Republican caucus. I think the truth of the matter, quite honestly, is I'm not sure that Moore and Berger agree with some of the stuff they do. I think Tim Moore, I don't think he really believes most of this stuff. He's always struck me as a, sort of a pragmatic politician who's sort of figuring out how to maintain his power. Phil Berger, I think, has probably gone through a bit of a transformation. In his early days in Raleigh, when he was the Republican minority leader, he used to call my colleague Fitzsimon all the time to talk about policy solutions. He was the one who sponsored legislation to get rid of partisan gerrymandering until he got in power and was in charge of it. I mean, it is true that a lot of what they have to do as leaders of their respective caucuses is they've got a bunch of cats they're herding. And right now, a lot of those cats sort of lean Trump. And they've got to figure out how they want to stay in power. So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot of the very ultra right agenda they probably don't really seriously adhere to. And I think there is a considerable number of, if we ever had a vote straight up or down, and it would be nice if it was a secret ballot, we would pass Medicaid expansion in North Carolina. We had passed it a decade ago. There are many Republican lawmakers who know that they've lost their local hospitals because the hospitals have gone bankrupt. They know that their people are suffering. They don't really believe this notion that we're going to get rid of Obamacare. We're going to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. They know we need to expand Medicaid. They know that it would create thousands of jobs and save thousands of lives. But you know, because the hardcore folks like the John Locke Foundation, who are really, you know, the ideological engine over there, still driving things, it's really tough for them to stand up to that. And so they have these votes in their caucus. And if 2/3 of the Republicans in the caucus say, we're going to do this, then the 1/3, you know, they don't buck them. And that just doesn't happen much these days. You know, they always say the Democrats, people who were Democrats always said they were never members of an organized party. They were always a Democrat, you know. Democrats tend to be a much more disorganized, contentious bunch. The Republicans, that's another aspect of how Trump has been so successful and how the right has been so successful because they're pragmatic. They stick together all the time, and that's been very effective for them. Any other?
May I ask the question?
Yes, ma'am.
You told us we need to stay in here for the long haul. And what you just said, I think, is a cautionary tale about the importance of getting a united front. We've got some obstacles to overcome in terms of gerrymandering, major funding that's been added for 20 or 30 years. What do you suggest is the most pragmatic steps to help progressives, to help Democrats get smarter and more pragmatic and more united?
Pragmatic solutions for progressives to remain more united and more effective. Well, I mean, a part of it is this commitment to the long haul. Part of it is the willingness to acknowledge the fact that a president like Joe Biden may not be perfect. He has a lot of flaws. He's not a perfect man, but I mean, my God, look at what he has had to endure and what the tools he's had to work with. It's been a pretty remarkably successful presidency. And I think there are a lot of, I mean, I remember what it was like to be a firebrand young person who wanted to change right now, but you gotta have that and a willingness to realize you gotta work with who you got. And so I think, you know, that's a real challenge for a lot of progressives. But I think maybe there is a higher degree of pragmatism. Having the threat of a Donald Trump out there and the basic threat to the survival of our democracy, not to mention the survival of our planet as we know it, can perhaps spur a higher degree of pragmatism amongst and togetherness amongst people who are caring and thinking. And I remain optimistic that that can happen. As to how it happens, it's just more events like this, more talking, more work, more social media posts, more, you know, walk in the precincts, reaching out, trying to build bridges across racial divides and communities. I mean, it's slow, boring, not very sexy work, but I think that's ultimately what it will take, I guess. Yes, sir. Oh, well, wait, here we have someone who hasn't asked a question.
I've heard Governor Cooper say recently that I think maybe 5 seats that need to get elected in order for him to be able to break a super majority. Otherwise, I mean, we're not going to get a majority, but at least prevent the Republicans from being able to override defense. So it seems to me one of the responses to this lady's question is, how do we know who to vote for? Who we get, how do we get our support? They voting in the right people, even with gerrymandering, is the quickest, best way
Sure.
to make a difference. And so for me, even though I've tried to look at it, one of the problems is how do you find the information? Because you get inundated by a million people who want money.
Yeah.
Where can you really spend your money, spend your time, where it's likely to make a difference? And are there some resources we can turn to for that? And I'll just say, Amy and I both got involved in a local campaign a few years ago, but unfortunately, our candidate didn't win. But we went out and knocked on the doors for the first time in December in my life, handed out literature, and the same phone call. And I would encourage everybody who's interested to go out and do it, because I think that during the pandemic, we could really not go on George very much for that. Those effective tools for getting people elected. And some people, we got no shot. They have an opposition running, but if you could share any information about.
Well, the question is, how do we know who to vote for, and how do we get more people, caring and thinking people elected to office? Again, there are good voter guides out there. There are good progressive groups, nonpartisan groups that do good, solid voter guides, especially for down ballot races. The group Democracy North Carolina does some really good work when it comes to voter guides, citizen voter guides. Common Cause has done some good stuff like that. We'll be posting some of that to the NC Policy Watch site in the days and weeks ahead. We have traditionally done pretty deep dives into who is running for the Court of Appeals and the state Supreme Court, just nonpartisan, straight. Here's what they say. Here's what their priorities are. I think you can glean a lot of information from that. Those races are enormously important. I think that suggestions that you make are all right on. It's all about work. It's about doing things that are not a lot of fun, like making phone calls and making political contributions and walking precincts and dropping off literature, sort of the basic politics 101. Sometimes we have to relearn some of those lessons, but those are all vitally important. And I think we should all stick with it.
Thank you again for being with us today. I cut my husband off. Ask another question, to be honest with you. We're so glad you're here. I wanted to have a few moments just to mention that we at Faith in the City are going to try to help unpack our local elections a little bit more in this way in the 2 months that we have remaining before our elections, because we do think it's important for us to have that kind of practical advice and suggestions and so on. So stay tuned as we're putting together our October and November sessions before the election, and we'll provide more information. And we also want to address issues that are of concern to you. So on the back table, again, as you leave, we have a sheet there, and if you want to suggest topics or speakers, I mean, we really are concerned about local elections and how we can sort of parse through the divisive issues that are out there. So many of you are working on these kinds of things in your congregations and other groups, so we welcome your ideas and suggestions, speakers and topics. So that is, they're on the back, and don't want to speak for Rob, but I'm sure if many of you have another question or two, stay for just a minute afterward, but we do pride ourselves on getting out at 1 o'clock. During your lunch hour. So thank you so much for being here. Again, stop by Suzanne Parker Miller's spot over there to learn about Mission Amplify, and Kathy Austin and her group at St. Paul's are doing starting again this year with their Faith and Justice series with Tricia McManus, our school superintendent, at the end of this month. So again, thank you. Join me in welcoming and thanking Rob. Thank you to our Zoom audience. We have quite a few folks there. We appreciate your being here.